Okay, this morning we're going to be covering the topic of the Puritan harmony and diversity, part one, as it says. We know that, as I have said before, the Puritans all shared doctrinal unity in terms of the fact that they were all Calvinists. They all embraced the doctrines of grace. They all taught the covenant of grace, and in that they were all unified. But it was also a time and a period when unity in some other things, theological as well as practical, were not defined and therefore adhered to in a uniform fashion. So I wanted to take an hour to kind of bring up some biographies here for you to get a picture of, and you can see the kind of differences that were among the men. And then we'll also look at that next week, and I'll introduce next week's Harmony and Diversity during this slide show. Just to back up by way of historical review, you remember at the end of the Westminster Confession series we had, I was telling you about how in preparation for the Westminster Assembly, which happened during Elizabeth I, that the Church of England, for all intents and purposes, had gone back and forth on their theological positions. They were being pulled from one direction by Roman Catholics who wanted to go back to the Mother Church. They were pulled by independent Anglicans who wanted to indeed form an independent church and to keep it, but not change much. There were others that were saying that we need to reform the church thoroughly, and so we need to pull away. And by this time there was also the introduction of Arminianism, which challenged the thing that they all held in common, which was Calvinism and the doctrines of grace. So there was a great tug of war going on. The statements here, or the books, the articles, the statements all reflect the official, unquote, position of the Anglican Church at the time. And you can see that during Henry VIII, they were just beginning to pull away from Roman Catholicism, but by the end of his reign, they were kind of drifting back. He had become the new pope. The church was going to, everything stays the same, but now that Henry, the king, is the pope. Then with Edward VI, things became, the pendulum swung all the way over again, and they had great ambitions, the Puritans did, for a reforming of the Church of England. Comes along Mary I, she is ardently Roman Catholic, and so there is no talk during her reign of any compromise or any articles of doctrine that would differ from the Roman Catholic Church. They are all taken out, but then comes Elizabeth I, and that's 10 years now since Edward, and she allows for the church to settle on the 39 Articles and says no farther, but that really only results in some chaos. And the Westminster divines are called in eventually to try to straighten out that as the church just breaks down during her reign. Now, some of the Puritan objections that come up do come from Roman Catholic backgrounds and trappings and things that we today may not think anything about, or say, yes, of course they would object to that, or whatever. But, reading through some of these things, the wearing of the required clerical vestments, which lifted the minister up into priestly status. You look up to him, he's the high and exalted priest, a la the Old Testament. There was a great ignoring of the book of Hebrews during this period of time, and saying that our pattern for worship, our pattern for church, our pattern for everything should be the Old Testament methodology and structure of the priesthood and all of that, the priesthood of Aaron. And that was carried over, and that was objected to. The assumed superiority of bishops over presbyters, the idea that bishop is a separate and exalted office over elders was a carryover from the Roman Catholic Church because they had built that pyramid-style government, and Anglican Church, many in the Anglican Church wanted to hold on to that. The lack of church discipline from the top down, priests, bishops, the king, everybody was indulging in adultery and having children, and this sin of financial corruption, and an overwhelming lack of education. There was ignorance rampant in the pulpits, and that radiated down to an apathetic church, lay people. They did not care. There was no morality. It was falling down from all over. There was a lack of liberty in the wording of prayers. The book of common prayer had to be, the church had to be worshiping uniformly, and so that all of that had to be rejected in the Puritan view. The many repetitions, the responses in worship, all the canned worship, you might say, had to be put aside. The Roman Catholic Church had already embraced and practiced the use of apocryphal books, and they wanted to get rid of that. The credible ability of ordained ministers to preach. Preaching, of course, in the Roman Catholic Church has long since been set aside by this time as being worthless. The sacraments are the worship of God. The worship of God is what the priests do all the way up front of the church. You are just watching. You're not even worshiping. In the Roman Catholic Church, you are not even a member of the church. The only members of the church are the officers, and they are the ones who are doing the worship, and all you do is come and watch them do the worship. And so the need to preach was a great burden among the Puritans at this time. Church festivals, saints' days, the structure of the calendar, which the ancient church had begun to set up, with the idea of ministering to an illiterate laity, that we will celebrate saints' days by way of teaching you their stories. So it had a positive and reasonable existence, but it just became parades and parties and rather meaningless kinds of things. And so the Puritans wanted to eliminate those. Cathedral worship, what I just described about worship being up front, the chanted prayers by the choirs, the extraneous music they wanted to get rid of, the use of the sign of the cross in baptism. This is seen as just superstition, the idea of signing the cross on the child's forehead or in the case of an adult in front of them was carryover from Roman Catholicism. Baptism by midwives, building that emergency kind of baptism so that the child does not die and go to hell or remain in purgatory. Replacement of parents with godparents, the rite of confirmation, kneeling at communion, bowing at the name of Jesus, all of these things the Puritans rejected. Before I go on, are there any questions of clarity regarding those or explanation?
What's the idea with the godparents?
The godparents, well, I don't know where the background is of that, but I know that in the Greek Orthodox Church, when a child is baptized, the parents are not even on the stage or next to the platform. It's the godparents who are there. They take the role of that substitution seriously. That's a positive comment. But in terms of the official nature of godparents recognized by the church, there's no scriptural warrant for it. It was practical, perhaps, if the parents die early, then we need somebody to be able, and that's quite all right. But bringing it into a religious context and making it a vow was objected to by the Puritans. Yeah.
I think your comment about people didn't live as long back then.
Yeah.
So therefore they had backup.
Sure.
So it was more practical than.
Yeah.
But then, of course, the ritual part of it.
The making it part of a religious ceremony.
Right.
Is
they were there, but
right. Yeah, there was a practical aspect to it, but yeah, Bob.
So you're saying this is what the Anglican Church brought into their.
Yeah.
So is this right at the beginning, or is this a generation or two in?
Well, this is from Henry VIII forward. Much of this was still practiced. There was no elimination of this. The only thing that was controversial by the end of Henry VIII's reign was kneeling at communion. The whole concept that, why the Roman Catholics would have you kneel to receive communion. And the Puritans said that's worshiping the elements, because the Roman Catholic Church teaches this is the literal body and blood of the Lord. But when that is gone, there's no reason to kneel, and so kneeling at communion was objected to. The Anglican Church just said, oh, we're used to it, let's just keep doing it. Dan?
That's fine. A little bit interesting that 400 years later, I mean, we pretty much are still in line with the Puritans. I mean,
right.
Not, other than, I mean, some churches, they wear the, robes, I guess, but most of the stuff, we haven't really gone back.
Lutheran ministers still wear very colorful robes. Methodists still have you kneel at the communion altar. They use the word. Communion rail. And there are still what we refer to now as high church kind of items that are still carryovers. The pietistic movement, I think, kind of defended some of these things, saying, we're looking for a piety, we're looking for an emotional attachment to God in worship, and so kneeling at communion just helps to conduce that emotion and stuff. And so there were, those kinds of arguments. Okay? We're good? All right. I told you that the Puritans kind of fell into 4 different categories, depending on where they stood on all of these issues and more. And they fell, the first category first of 2 general categories are conformists and nonconformists. The conformists are those who want to see some changes, but we are willing to stay in the church. We don't think leaving the church is the answer, and we're thinking that we can work on reforming some of these things from the inside. As I described this, of course, nothing has changed. We hear that very same kind of debate today in our denomination. Some wish to reform the church theologically from inside. Some wanted to just change some practical things. We're okay theologically, we have no problem, but maybe some practical things. Maybe we can change some things like whether we have to have the stated prayers or not. Can't we come up, we're able to pray. Can't we just make up our own, create our own prayers? So there were 2 kind of classifications of conformists. The nonconformists, there were also 2. Some objected to governmental influence. They didn't want the governmental control of the church. And they saw the Anglican Church as hierarchical and going up to the king, and they wanted to do away with that, or the queen. And the way to do that, of course, is to go after the office of bishop. The bishop is under the king's control. The bishop controls the local churches. And the bishop is the one that if he can be dismissed, if we can get rid of the bishops, then the church is disengaged from the king. And you remember that's what James VI realized when he said, no bishop, no king, no authority. I lose authority over the church, which was just not acceptable in his day. And for the most part, the nonconformists wanted to still adopt the Presbyterian form of government that was coming over and being pressed strongly from Scotland. And this was the idea that the church is independent, but there is active recognition of the monarchy, and that we are not against the government. We want to submit to the government, and we want to work with that. But then the 4th category were those who objected to governmental authority, not just interference, but authority. They challenged. They said the government's got no business having anything to do with the church. And they began advocating a separation. They would be called, this 4th category we called separatists. And they argued for a separation of church and state completely, and they even rejected Presbyterianism because they suspected that the king would abuse it and take control through presbyteries. Instead of a bishop, they would take control of the presbyteries. So they thought, okay, we're just going apples to oranges, and we don't want the presbyteries either. So Presbyterianism was rejected by the separatists, and they pushed more and more for independency. Now, just to be clear for you, it's the last category The nonconformists who objected to governmental authority, those are the ones, the most radical are the ones who will get in the Mayflower and sail over to the Americas. The rest won't. These guys, the ones who are most motivated, the separatists, the radicals, they are the ones who will be among the Puritans in America. All right, what I want to do for the rest of the hour is just quickly survey some biographies of these guys, give you an idea of how different they are and where they come from and what they hoped for and what they were working on. All of these men are virtual contemporaries. They're all in the first half, generally speaking, of the 16th century, of the 17th century. And so they're all kind of growing up and thriving and prospering together, and we'll see how things go for them. I'll focus first on a man named Richard Sibs. You can see he was born before the 17th century, but he died in 1635. He was born in Tostock, a little town, father to a wheelwright. This is a wagon repair guy. So he's not of high rank, social or economic rank. He's a son of a mechanic. But he did manage to attend St. John's College in Cambridge. You remember Cambridge becomes an early hotbed of Puritanism. And he enters it by 18. He gets his bachelor's. He gets his he becomes a fellow. He gets his master's. By 1603, after he gets his degrees at Cambridge, he says he's converted. He's persuaded under the preaching of William Perkins. We talked about Perkins before and his influence over so many of these men. He was influenced under him. And in 1608, he is ordained. He receives his Bachelor of Divinity in 1610. And in 1611, he's invited to be a lecturer at Holy Trinity Church in Cambridge. And his preaching is so powerful, so winsome, I'll put it that way, so attractive, that the crowds that come to the church building are overwhelming, and they have to build a gallery, to an upstairs gallery in order to accommodate the people. The deacons are working on that here because I'm so popular. No. John Cotton and Hugh Peters are another two. You'll hear about John Cotton in the evening lectures. Were both converted under his preaching, and he also discipled Thomas Goodwin, a well-known author, and John Preston. In 1617, he is a lecturer for Gray's Inn. That's not a bar or a hotel. It's the name of the location where the church is. And he's a lecturer there. In 1626, he becomes the master of St. Catherine's College, Cambridge. Graduates include several men who you probably haven't heard of. Maybe you might take note of William Strong, but all these guys are prominent in the Westminster Assembly. They are all invited to participate as divines in the assembly. He receives his doctorate from Cambridge, and in 1631 he's offered charge of the Holy Trinity Church, Holy Trinity College, Cambridge, by Charles I. He dies in 1635. So his career goes up. He just continues to ascend in prestige and in recognition and in authority. But when he dies, he says, I don't want my burial to have any stone or anything. And to this day, they still don't know where Richard Sibs has been buried. Richard Sibs is described as a gentle man, never married, but with astonishing network of friendships of godly ministers, noted lawyers, and parliamentary leaders of the early Stuart era. So he was very friendly. He was a connector. He was politically astute, and he spoke very softly and built bridges. He was that kind of man. He avoided controversies. He didn't want to be the nail that needed to be pounded down, but nonetheless he worked in subtle and quiet ways to oppose Archbishop Laud, who was trying to force Anglicanism on everybody during the reign of Charles I. He opposed also Roman Catholics and Arminians. He influenced Anglicanism, Presbyterianism, and independency. That's pretty hard to do. So the man is is very gentle spoken, and he's very influential, and people listen to him. So Richard Sibs is somebody who is very effective. He was a faithful member of the Elizabethan Church. He was an Anglican all the way and worshipped according to the Book of Common Prayer. That did not faze him. He did not have any problem doing that, and he was a conformist. His complete works are published in 7 volumes, and he's most well known for 2 of those, one called The Bruised Reed and the other Glorious Freedom. I can commend both of these to you. You'll find him gentle in his speech and encouraging. We go from there to Joseph Aleene. He's born in, I don't know how to pronounce that, so I'll say Wiltshire, to a prestigious family. Now, he's upper crust. And interestingly enough, he is a covenant child. He's one who grew up saying, there was never a day in my life that I did not know the Lord, love the Lord, and wanted to serve Him from childhood. He entered Oxford at 16. That's 2 years earlier than Sibs. And he was taught by John Owen. We'll meet John Owen in just a minute. He graduated from Oxford in 1653. By 1655, he was an assistant pastor at St. Mary Magdalene in Taunton, which was a Puritan stronghold. So even though he attended Oxford, he came to this church and he was inundated with Puritan thinking. And I'm sure he was challenged in that regard. He married his cousin, Theodosia Aleene. We mention her by name because she ran a homeschool of no less than 50 scholars. Take that, you homeschoolers. See, you're not doing enough. This woman was amazing. And most of these, of course, scholars would be in her home, which meant cooking, cleaning, da-da-da-da-da. And so she was just amazing. Richard Baxter says that Joseph Aleene had great ministerial skillfulness, melting, convincing, powerful language, all very nice. However, he hit a wall and was found and was ejected in 1662 when the Act of Nonconformity, the Act of Conformity was passed. He was singled out for his nonconformity, and he was tossed out of his pulpit. He was not allowed to preach. He was cast into prison, but he continued to preach to crowds who would assemble outside the prison window. He would preach through the bars to them. And in 1665, he was arrested again, and perhaps it was imprisonment that broke his health, and he died at the age of 34. So he had an up and down career, but even though he was harassed for being a nonconformist, he was still buried with honors at St. Mary Magdalene Church in Somerset. So perhaps that was because of his youth. I don't know. His famous work by far is called An Alarm to the Unconverted. And as it's quoted here, that book is a model of Puritan evangelism, well suited to today's distortions of the gospel. And again, I commend this one to you. An Alarm to the Unconverted. Very, very good. William Gurnall, 1616 to 1679. He's born in St. Margaret's Parish in King's Lynn. He attends Emmanuel College in Cambridge, gets his BA and his MA. He becomes a curate at Lavenham in West Suffolk. He serves there for 35 years. Many of these Puritans had very long and effective ministries in one place. But he chose to remain within the Church of England, being ordained in 1662, submitting deliberately to the Act of Uniformity. So whereas, Joseph Aleene, for one, said no and was caught and arrested, tossed out of his pulpit, William Gurnall says, I submit to this, and that was the choice that he made. Perhaps also out of humility, his burial is in Lavenham in an unmarked grave. William Gurnall is by far best known for his magnum opus work on Ephesians 6, 10 to 20. The armor of God. This is over 1,100 pages. 1,100 pages on 10 verses. And it continues to be published today. Mostly it's done in 3 volumes so that you don't have to hold 1,100 pages at once while you're trying to read at night before you go to bed. It's a lot to hold up. The book itself is easily 3 inches thick. And then comes John Owen. Many people have heard of John Owen. He's one of the more well-known Puritans of the day. And his career is very interesting. And so we want to follow this in a little detail. He is the son of a pastor, son of a local Puritan vicar, so he grew up with Puritan influence. And he shows no sign of the PK syndrome, no rebellion, no pushing back on what he was taught. He is enrolled in Queen's College, Oxford at 12 years old. He goes to college at 12 years old. He will be the second youngest such Puritan to enter the college level. You'll meet one more that goes in even younger than that at our evening lectures. Gets his BA, his master's. He leaves Oxford due to Laud's new conforming statutes. William Laud, during Charles I, is forcing Anglicanism, high Anglicanism, on everybody. And out of protest, Owen leaves Oxford because he wants to make a point of he doesn't want to be kicked out, but he abandons the pulpit out of protest. And he enters into something called private chaplaincy. What this is a well-to-do family, perhaps in a small community, would call a minister to be their family chaplain. And that chaplain could tutor, perhaps broad educational topics and subjects, but also teach and preach under the family's domicile authority. But then the family would extend his exposure to, or the exposure of him to, the community. And so small towns would have an opportunity to get good preaching, and they would come and listen to Owen on the laird's land. And so this was a way to sneak in being a pastor someplace where it wasn't approved. And it was, but on the surface, he was nothing more than a religious tutor to his family, and so he didn't. That you wouldn't catch much attention for doing that. But so he did that in 2 or 3 different places. He pastored later in Fordham, and signed the Solemn League and Covenant. You remember that? The Solemn League and Covenant is the theological proposal of agreement of Scotland with England and England's civil agreement with Scotland. Now the Civil War is bubbling up, and England needs Scotland's army. Scotland wants Presbyterian influence on England, and so they come together and they sign the Solemn League and Covenant. And Owen, being an Englishman, is on the side of wanting the Scottish military on their side, and so he signs on to the Solemn League and Covenant. But that also he's also demonstrating an inclination toward supporting the Presbyterian structure and vision of Scotland at that time. In 1646, he becomes the vicar of St. Peter's in Coggeshall, and so he is continuing to move up. However, right about that time, he declares very openly he has been persuaded to abandon Presbyterianism. After this far, being a Presbyterian soldier, if you will, he is persuaded that you cannot trust the king and presbyteries not to become the new bishop. And he is much more inclined to say we need a clear demarcation between church and state. And so he abandons Presbyterianism and embraces Congregationalism, and he becomes a leading theologian for independency from that point on. He's invited, he has such a name for himself that he's invited to preach for for Cromwell the day after Charles I is executed. Kind of an awkward situation, perhaps. Cromwell is very impressed with John Owen and invites him to be in the inner circle. He doesn't become his chaplain, but he is definitely a theological advisor. Cromwell takes him to his exploits with him to his exploits in Scotland and keeps him close. And John Owen has great influence over Cromwell. And as a result of that, his career continues to go up and up and up and up and up. In 1650, he's appointed official preacher to the state, and he preaches at Whitehall Chapel. That's his official preaching point. 1651, he becomes the Dean of Christ College, Church College in Oxford. In 1652, he becomes Vice Chancellor of Oxford University, the whole thing, Vice Chancellor. 1653, he's granted a doctorate in divinity by Oxford. And in 1658, he becomes the primary author of the Savoy Declaration. You remember what that is? That's the independent response to the Presbyterian Confession, the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is Presbyterian by slant. And just a few weeks after the confession is published, they gather together in Savoy Castle, and the independents tweak the paragraphs that they don't like, and they come out with their own version of the confession, and that's called the Savoy Declaration. And John Owen is the primary author of that document. But then, Cromwell dies, and England is once again in an uproar, and out of desperation and a complete lack of faith in Richard Cromwell, the son, they bring back the monarchy. And Charles II comes to the throne. This is Charles I's son, and Charles II, to remind you, is out for vengeance. You killed my dad. I'm going to make sure that you're treated properly. And Owen's career takes a dive. In 1658, he loses his appointments at Oxford University, interestingly enough, to Presbyterians. Must have been an insult. And his preaching opportunities at Oxford were stopped. We no longer need your preaching, thank you, Mr. Owen. 1660, the deanship of Christ Church is taken from him. And in 1662 is the Great Ejection. That's when these Puritan ministers are told you must leave your pulpits and not live within 5 miles of your previous pastorate. And so Owen retreats to his previous formula of preaching in small locations under the radar, so to speak. And he manages to preach at Stadhampton. And forgive my pronunciation, I'm sure the English are just going nuts over that. 1665, he is indicted at Oxford for holding religious services in his home. So his name follows him, and now he can't seem to get away from it. In 1683, he dies in London. Now, this is an interesting situation. You've got a man who soared in popularity and in prestige, and then his career completely collapsed with the passing of the favor of Puritanism in England. And so he is buried in a place called Bunhill Fields. Bunhill Fields is in the city of London, and it is the, well, to put it crassly, it is the non-christened ground, if you will, to use Roman Catholic kind of, the others, the riffraff, the pagans, the ones we don't like. We reserve Bunhill Fields for those burials, and John Owen is buried in Bunhill Fields. That's his grave, as it was when I was visiting there, and you can clearly read his name on the side. He's buried across the path from Isaac Watts, by the way, which is just across the way. He was, I guess, considered also a nonconformist. And there's several others. There's Susanna Wesley, there's Gill, there's several others that are buried in Bunhill Fields. John Owen was a prolific writer. His works are collected and published into 16 volumes. He is hard to read because he is so educated and theological. And he's hard to grasp. It takes time to work through John Owen. So when you pick up any of the Banner of Truth paperbacks by John Owen, know that his works, his writing has been worked on and edited for your benefit. And so don't be afraid to pick up a John Owen with that regard. You will be blessed by what you read. One of the most, I didn't put it up here, but one of the best ones to pick up and read by Owens is a booklet called The Death of Death in the Death of Christ. The Death of Death and the Death of Christ. And it's very good. He also wrote 7 volumes on the book of Hebrews. Commentary on the book of Hebrews. We come now to John Bunyan. Anybody ever heard of John Bunyan? An obscure kind of guy. Nobody pays attention to John Bunyan anymore. Born in 1628 in Elstow near Bedford. This is just a little podunk town. His dad is the tinker. Sometimes we think of him as the tinker. His dad is the tinker. He goes around repairing pots and pans. You can't just go to Target and get a new pan. He does that. John Bunyan is not educated well at all, and kind of grows up illiterate. In fact, there's some challenging the works of John Bunyan, saying he couldn't have written to this because he was not literate enough, and that's the reason for that challenge. He was rebellious as a kid, and didn't care about much of anything. Joined Cromwell's army at 16, probably just to get out of the house. He had a very interesting occasion during that military career that stuck with him. It was not a moment of conversion, but it was a point that always stayed with him. He had a particular assignment for a military attack, and at last minute somebody else, another soldier, stepped in for him, and that soldier was killed. And that always stunned him and made him realize perhaps something else is going on. In 1648, he marries, but we don't have the name of the woman he married. Interesting. But except we do know that she brought with her only dowry. She had nothing, so a pauper marries a pauper here. She brings 2 books. That's all she has. One is The Plain Man's Pathway to Heaven by a Puritan named Arthur Dent. And the other is The Practice of Piety by Bailey. The Plain Man's Pathway to Heaven could very well be the inspiration for Pilgrim's Progress that we'll look at in just a second. But he remembers that. He read those, and that made a difference in him. It started to work on his conscience. In 1651, he is introduced to a man named John Gifford. John Gifford is the pastor of a small church in Bedford, and they are experimenting with something that is beginning to be thought about and talked about in England at the time, and that is whether or not infant baptism itself is a carryover from the Roman Catholic Church. Maybe we shouldn't baptize infants until they profess faith. And as I've mentioned before, this is really more of a definition between the invisible and the visible church. And Bedford apparently had some folks who were arguing both sides, and he pastored a church that was inclusive. To use a bad word, I'm sorry. We'll accept anybody kind of thing in this regard. He didn't want that to be a problem. Just so you understand, Paedo-Baptist means baptism of infants. Anti-Paedo-Baptists are what we call Baptists today. So Baptists today are anti-Paedo-Baptists. And you can see why that was all dropped, just to make it easy. In 1655, he begins preaching at this church, but unfortunately his wife died, and he remarries a woman, and this woman we know the name of. Her name is Elizabeth. In 1660, he is arrested for preaching without a license. He is a separatist. He's a radical. He refuses to cease preaching if released. They ask him, if we let you go, well, they do not press charges. They just simply incarcerate him, saying, we'll get to this when we get to this. So he's in jail. And eventually they asked him, he says, if we let you go, will you stop preaching? And he said, no. So they held him in jail for 12 and a half years. And all the while, his wife, almost daily, is coming to the courts and coming to the lawyers and coming to the judges and saying, what's the deal, what's the deal, what's the deal? And let my husband go. And they just continue to ignore her. Bunyan denounces the Church of England as false. He can't do basically more than that. Says, it's a false church. He doesn't want anything to do with it. In 1672, he's been released by this time. He is appointed to follow Gifford at the Bedford church. So now he's the pastor of the church. In 1676, just 4 years later, he is imprisoned a second time. And he's incarcerated now for a year and a half, and it is in that period of time that he writes The Pilgrim's Progress. He is released in 1677 through the influences of John Owen, still in the heyday of his career. His works are collected into 3 volumes today. Everybody knows the Pilgrim's Progress, but as it turns out, Bunyan is quite literate, quite prolific in his writing. And his works are collected into 3 volumes, and they all have pastoral or analogical or illustrative kinds of writings. He writes things like the Holy War, which is very similar to style to the Pilgrim's Progress. He writes several other works are along that line, trying to preach to the common man. These are some of the ones that have been pulled aside and printed separately, and I commend any of those to you. Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners is effectively his biography. Some people would say Pilgrim's Progress is, but he says this is my biography right here, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. And so he writes much more than just the one book, but he is popular for the Pilgrim's Progress. And as one historian says, he sold more than 100,000 copies in its first decade in print, and has since been reprinted in at least 1,500 editions and translated into more than 200 languages, with Dutch, French, and Welsh editions appearing in his lifetime. So the popularity of this book exploded while he was still alive. Some scholars have asserted that with the exception of the Bible, and perhaps Thomas à Kempis' The Imitation of Christ, this Bunyan classic has sold more copies than any other book ever written, and I do think it holds the record, second to the Bible, of being the book that remains in print continually from that day forward. It's never been out of print. An amazing story. Bunyan, remember, was a separatist, rejected the Church of England. Where is he buried? Bunhill Fields. He gets a little more press, a little more attention. He is outside of the perimeter gate. You walk through those pillars, and the perimeter gate extends then in a box. But outside the gate, for whatever reason, Bunyan is buried all by his lonesome there, and he has quite the edifice to commemorate him. His famous statue is, you see that in these videos that I show you, his famous statue is in Bedford. And it shows him looking to the skies and with his hand on the Bible. Next we come to Richard Baxter. Richard Baxter is also a Puritan some of you have probably heard of before. This man is very interesting in who he is. Born from 1615 to 1691. He is raised by his grandparents because his father is in debt and his mother is sickly. And his dad eventually comes to the point where he is broken and he becomes a believer first. And he gives the gospel to his son Richard, and he persuades Richard, and the Spirit of God uses the father to convert Richard and bring him to faith. And he was then influenced by the writings of Perkins and Sibs, and so he's off to a good start, even though his beginning is quite rough. He entered Roxeter Grammar School. He's assisted financially by John Owen, but he decides to forego university teaching. He decides, I don't need the upper school degrees. I don't need to go into Oxford. I don't need to go into Cambridge. All these other guys went, I'm going to do my own thing. And so he studies theology privately, whether it was, rebellion or stubbornness on his part or separatist kind of influence, or whether he was poor. I haven't been able to figure that out. But he forgoes university training, and for 4 years he just studies privately. He just reads and he studies on his own. He's initially leaning toward conformity. He throughout his career, he kind of goes back and forth. He's a little bit wishy-washy in this. And I would have to say, to be biased about this, I would have to say that probably the reason for his going back and forth on this issue is because he wasn't theologically trained at a university level. University teaching at this point is very rich and very good, especially at at Cambridge. And to do it on his own means he is subject to a lot of different voices without much perspective and balance. And so that does show up in his career. So he first starts off leaning towards conformity. I'm going to be a part of the Anglican Church. I'm going to go along with the tribe. And he's ordained minister, and he becomes the assistant minister in Bridgenorth, Shropshire. And then in 1641, he becomes the curate at Kidderminster. This is his big claim to fame. He spends 21 years preaching at Kidderminster. Kidderminster is a blue-collar town, rough, lots of hard living, and not much use for religion. And he comes and he does what the Bible tells him to do rather than compromise and try to win by being nice and warm and fuzzy, which is what many ministers mistake in their pastorates. He preaches the gospel in solid form. He requires a profession of faith in order to come before the Lord's Supper. Duh. And he holds them accountable, and after a while he begins to see numerous conversions coming. And by the end of his 21 years at Kidderminster, most of the town would say has drastically changed. The culture of the town has completely changed. Most of the town would say they are now Christian and credit Baxter in one way, shape, or form. He created or invented, if I can use the term, the household visits, and he would visit his people on a regular basis. And he would teach the husband and lead them in devotions and correct the children. And he was very hands-on. He was very devoted to the families in his church, and things continued to do well. He supported the parliamentary army. That's against Charles I. The parliamentary army is the same army that Bunyan had joined. He supported the parliamentary army, but he did not appreciate Cromwell's toleration of separatists. So he's leaning now towards conformity. He doesn't understand why Cromwell is being nice to the separatists, those who want to disconnect the church from the government. And so he's having some problems and issues there. But still, he casts himself now as only an occasional conformer. So he's on the fence himself. He opposes the Solemn League and Covenant. Remember, John Owen signed it. He opposes this. He doesn't want Scottish influence. He thinks that we should do it on our own. And he favors the monarchy and accepts the prayer book. He says, we can do this. We can work within the Anglican Church. But in 1662, his independent streak begins to rise up. And when 1662, Charles II puts down his act of conformity, you will conform to the Anglican Church, he cannot accept that, and he is thrown out of his work at Kidderminster. So he takes his stand finally and he says, I cannot do this. I cannot be a conformist. And he is ejected from this very powerful, very effective, very godly ministry at Kidderminster. That is basically the peak of his career. Like Owen, things don't go well for him now because he opposes the government and he's going to be persecuted for it. And that is, again, the story that we hear again and again. He settles in London at the age of 50, but he's arrested 3 times for preaching in informal situations and without proper approval and structure. They take away his library from him. Say, we'll show you, we'll take your books away. And he's never again given an official pastoral charge. In 1685, he is so influential, he is so still powerful enough, that he's charged with attacking the episcopacy, which effectively is supposed to be punished with a public whipping. But he is spared his whipping because of who he is. And finally, in 1681, just 2 years before his death, William and Mary passed the Edict of Toleration. Not the Act of Conformity, the Act of Toleration. Now we're going to come into an age in England, we're going to accept everybody, we don't care what you believe. You can be to any kind of church you want, and that's okay. The Act of Toleration came and brought relief for him personally. He preached occasionally, but he primarily gave himself to his writings. And in 1691, he died peacefully, and now he is able to have a dignified burial, and he's buried below Greyfriars Church in London. What Richard Baxter is not known for so much comes out of that lack of education that he received when he was young, and that is that along with his fence writing in ecclesiastical matters, he also rides the fence theologically, particularly with regard to the doctrine of justification. This sounds almost ridiculous for us, but it is how a man is justified before a holy God is the area where he drifts off to the left, we'll say. In his book, Aphorisms of Justification, he argues that, yes, there is a combination of divine grace and human will. That it is a 50-50 kind of thing. God comes so far and the sinner comes so far. And so he's rejecting the doctrines of grace in that regard. And this has disappointed those studying his legacy ever since. His doctrines of God's decrees and atonement and justification all frequently lean more towards Arminianism. He advocates the will of man to reach out and to embrace God in Christ on his own. And he also leans for universal redemption. He thinks Christ died for everyone, making salvation possible for all. And then he also rejects the doctrine of total depravity. He rejects the idea of reprobation, that some are condemned to hell from before the beginning of time. So Baxter drifts very significantly in some areas. And so if you read Richard Baxter, you need to be careful about what you read, because he does waffle on these issues and slides in some dangerous areas. But what he's most famous for, and works that I can commend to you heartily, first of all is a book called The Saints' Everlasting Rest, which is a book he wrote in 1647 when he was recuperating from an illness that threatened his life, and he knew it, and he was reflecting on the rest promised in Hebrews 4, I think, and wrote a book, The Saints' Everlasting Rest. Very encouraging book, very rich in hope and in building up of the saints. And among seminarians, he's also well known for his 1651 book, The Reformed Pastor. The Reformed pastor, in my mind, should be required reading for every seminarian. It's not, as far as I know, but it should be. With regard to the word Reformed, he does not just mean Calvinistic, but there is a sense in which he means Spirit-filled. And so even there's a little bit of care that could be taken. But his work is, well, to put it bluntly, it is stunning in its frankness, speaking to the conscience of the man who would be a minister of God. And it is excellent. I wish the men in our presbytery were required to read that book, because I think that we would straighten out a lot of issues that need straightening out at the very core of our thinking and our arguments. It's described here, remarkably convicting and renouncing of pastoral pride, which is a very easy thing to have. There's a Reformed pastor. There is Richard's famous statue before Kidderminster Church. This is a remarkable pose. It's very admirable. He's in the midst of preaching the word, and it's a striking statue. Okay, any questions?
Any relation to Dennis Baxter?
I think it was his father-in-law.
When he was at Kidderminster,
Kidderminster.
Kidderminster, now that was an Anglican church?
Probably, yeah. Yeah.
I'm thinking it was.
Yeah.
Then my question is.
Would have to be.
Yeah. Who is the authority that's throwing him into prison?
That's from the king down,
It's because the Anglican church.
or the queen.
is controlled by the king.
Yeah. Well, in his day and age, it would have been Charles II, and Charles II enforced his authority over the church even stronger than Elizabeth and Charles I did, and he had the police out there looking for you, and it would be the authority of the crown that would throw you in jail. Now, next week, we're going to look again, part 2 of Harmony and Diversity, and I'm going to show you a video that's going to take up pretty much the entire hour, and it consists of 2 men who will give their perspective on this issue that was just beginning to get traction during John Bunyan's day. The one will be a speaker talking about the covenant of grace and the way that the majority of the Puritans of the day understood baptism. And then you'll also hear from one other who paints and describes the theological argument from the anti-Paedo-Baptistic side. Got that? Which side is that again? Anti-Paedo-Baptistic, the Baptist side. Oh yeah, the Baptist side. Why didn't you just say that in the first place? Anyway, okay? All right, let's pray. Father, thank you very much for the men that we have to understand leave a great legacy behind. We can see, Lord, that even many of these men paid the price for their convictions and for their grasp of the Bible. We see the exercise of authority that would motivate many of them to reject that authority that is not scriptural, and to suffer whatever was required of them because of that commitment. And Lord, it helps us also, even in our own day and age, to see that persecution of the church is not new. It is not unto utter destruction of the church. It is a period of time when it is to the advantage of a government to oppress religion. And Lord, that the only hope and the only strength the church has is not in herself, but in the Spirit of God to rise up and bring a new reformation in our day and age. We plead for that, Lord, and we ask for it, and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.